Some secrets don't survive time. They wait for the right person to uncover them. The crystal chandelier above me scattered warm light across the ballroom, turning every glass, every diamond, every polished surface into 1,000 tiny stars. I never belonged in places like this. At 27, I spent my days teaching art to middle school students in Brooklyn, not attending charity galas in Midtown Manhattan where a single table probably cost more than my monthly rent. But Principal Foster had insisted. Smile. Shake a few hands. Help the donors feel connected to the school. So there I was, standing near the edge of the room in a navy blue dress I had worn 3 years in a row, quietly counting the minutes until I could leave. My fingers drifted to the ring on my right hand. They always did when I was nervous. The silver band was old, worn smooth by decades of use. Tiny scratches caught the light whenever I moved. My adoptive mother had given it to me shortly before she passed away. She never explained where it came from. Only that it mattered. Only that I should never lose it. I twisted it absent-mindedly, while pretending to listen to a conversation about investment portfolios and luxury real estate. Across the ballroom, a string quartet played something elegant and expensive. Waiters floated between tables carrying trays of champagne. Everything felt polished, perfect, predictable. Then the room changed. I noticed it before I understood why. Conversations softened. Heads turned. People stepped aside. A path opened through the crowd without anyone being asked. I followed the movement and saw him.
Alexander Romano.
Even if you'd never met him, you knew the name. Manhattan was full of rumors about Alexander.
Billionaire investor.
Philanthropist. Power broker. A man whose influence reached places most people never saw. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. Dark hair. Sharp features. Calm confidence. The kind of presence that made everyone else feel slightly smaller. I expected him to walk past me without noticing I existed. Men like him didn't notice women like me. But halfway across the ballroom he stopped. Completely. Stop. His eyes locked onto mine. No, not mine. My hand. More specifically, the ring. The color drained from his face so quickly I thought I imagined it. The champagne glass in his hand slipped. Not enough to fall. Just enough for the liquid inside to spill over the rim. Around him, conversations died. The musicians kept playing, but somehow the entire room felt silent. Alexander stared at the ring as though he had seen a ghost. His expression wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It looked closer to disbelief. The kind that comes when reality suddenly stops making sense. Then he started walking toward me. Fast. People moved aside instinctively. My heartbeat stumbled. Every step brought him closer until he stood directly in front of me. Up close, his eyes were an unusual shade of gray-blue. Sharp, focused, searching. He didn't introduce himself. Didn't offer a greeting. His gaze never left the ring. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only I could hear it. Where did you get that ring? I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak, his eyes widened slightly. He had noticed something engraved inside the band, and whatever he had just seen made him look even paler than before. My pulse hammered so loudly that I barely heard the music anymore. Alexander Romano continued staring at the inside of the ring, as though the tiny engraving had reached across decades and grabbed hold of him. For a moment neither of us spoke. The crowd around us seemed frozen in place, pretending not to watch while clearly watching everything. Then he lifted his eyes to mine again. The controlled confidence I had noticed earlier was gone. In its place was something far more unsettling. Shock. Genuine shock. Who gave this to you? He asked quietly. I swallowed. My mother. The answer came automatically. Then I corrected myself. My adoptive mother. Something flickered across his face. Not relief. Not disappointment. Something closer to confirmation. He glanced back at the ring. His jaw tightened. And before her? I shook my head. I do not know. The silence stretched between us. Around us, conversations slowly resumed. Glasses clinked. The quartet continued playing. But the world felt different now, tilted slightly off balance. Alexander looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly had one missing piece returned after many years. Claire, he said. Hearing my name from his mouth made my stomach tighten. How do you know my name? I asked. A faint smile touched his lips, though it never reached his eyes. Everyone attending tonight was on the guest list. It was a reasonable answer. Too reasonable. Before I could question it, a silver-haired woman approached us carrying a champagne flute. Alexander, she said warmly, the board is waiting for you. He never looked away from me. Give me 5 minutes. The woman blinked in surprise. Apparently people did not usually tell Alexander Romano to hurry. She nodded and disappeared back into the crowd. His attention returned immediately to the ring. May I see it? Every instinct told me to refuse. The ring was one of the few things I had left from my family. Yet something in his expression stopped me. He did not look greedy. He looked haunted. Slowly, I slipped the ring off my finger and placed it in his hand. The metal looked strangely small against his palm. He turned it beneath the ballroom lights. His thumb brushed the engraving inside. His breathing seemed to stop for a fraction of a second. Then he closed his fist around it. I felt an unexpected flash of panic. Alexander. My voice came out sharper than intended. His eyes lifted immediately. For the first time all evening, he appeared to realize how strange this situation must seem from my perspective. He opened his hand and returned the ring. I am sorry. The apology sounded sincere. You have no reason to trust me. I slid the ring back onto my finger. Then maybe you should explain why you look like you have seen a ghost. A long silence followed. His gaze drifted past me toward the towering windows overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of city lights glittered against the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. Because 24 years ago, I saw that ring on someone I never expected to lose. A chill ran through me. Before I could ask another question, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. Whatever message appeared there erased every trace of emotion from his face. The mask returned instantly. Controlled. Powerful. Untouchable. But not before I noticed one final thing. For a brief second, as he looked at the ring on my hand, he seemed almost afraid. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and said 5 words that changed everything. Claire, your file does not exist. The drive home should have taken 22 minutes. Instead, it felt like 2 hours. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, while the city lights blurred into long streaks of gold and white. Alexander's final words refused to leave my head. Your file does not exist. Every few blocks I found myself touching the ring again, running my thumb across the smooth silver surface as though it might suddenly explain everything. By the time I reached my apartment building in Brooklyn, my nerves were stretched thin. The old brick building looked exactly as it always had. 3 stories. Flickering hallway light. The smell of fresh laundry drifting from somewhere upstairs. Familiar. Normal. I desperately needed normal. Inside my apartment, I kicked off my shoes, dropped my purse onto the kitchen counter, and stood motionless in the silence. The gala already felt unreal. Like something that had happened to another person. I poured a glass of water and opened the small wooden box where I kept the few belongings my adoptive mother had left behind. A faded photograph. 2 postcards. A handwritten birthday card. Nothing unusual. Nothing mysterious. Nothing that explained why one of the most powerful men in New York had looked at my ring like it belonged in a grave. My phone buzzed. The sudden sound made me jump. Unknown number. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. Hello. Silence. Then a woman's voice. Calm. Professional. Miss Bennett, this is Margaret Hayes from Romano Holdings. My stomach tightened immediately. How did you get my number? Mr. Romano asked me to deliver a message. Of course he did. What message? A brief pause followed. He would like to meet with you tomorrow morning. I laughed once. Not because anything was funny. Because the entire situation was becoming ridiculous. Tell Mr. Romano I am a teacher. I have a job. He anticipated that response. The woman sounded almost amused. The meeting can take place after school. I walked toward the window overlooking the street below. Rain continued falling in soft silver lines beneath the street lamps. Why? Another pause. Longer this time. He believes you may be connected to something important. Connected. The word lingered in the air. Not involved. Not responsible. Connected. And if I say no? I asked. Then nothing changes. Her voice remained perfectly polite. But I believe you have questions too. The line went quiet. She was right. I hated that she was right. After ending the call, I slept badly. Dreams came in fragments. A woman laughing. A silver ring. The sound of waves crashing somewhere far away. None of it made sense. Morning arrived gray and cold. I taught classes. Graded assignments. Smiled at students. Pretended everything was normal. Yet all day I felt watched by a question I could not answer. When the final bell rang, I walked toward the faculty parking lot. Halfway there I stopped. A black sedan sat across the street. Parked. Waiting. It might have meant nothing. Probably meant nothing. Yet when the rear passenger door opened and a man stepped out holding an umbrella, my pulse immediately quickened. He approached with calm confidence and handed me a sealed envelope. Miss Bennett. What is this? He offered no explanation. Only a respectful nod before returning to the car. Moments later the sedan disappeared into traffic. My fingers felt strangely cold as I opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. Old. Slightly faded. A woman stood on a beach holding a small child in her arms. The child could not have been older than 3. At first I only noticed the ocean behind them. Then I saw the woman's hand resting against the child's shoulder. And the silver ring on her finger was identical to mine. I stared at the photograph until the edges blurred. The woman looked familiar in the strange way people sometimes do in dreams. Blonde hair moved by the ocean wind. A soft smile. One arm wrapped protectively around the little girl she held against her side. The child faced the camera, laughing at something outside the frame. I could not see every detail clearly. The image was old. Sun-faded. Worn by time. But the ring was unmistakable. The same shape. The same silver band. The same engraving hidden on the inside. My fingers tightened around the photograph. Questions crashed through my mind faster than I could process them. Who was she? Why did Alexander have this picture? And why send it to me instead of simply explaining what he knew? The answers did not come that night. They followed me into the next morning. Into my classroom. Into every lesson and conversation. By lunchtime I had checked my phone 6 times, half expecting another mysterious message. Nothing arrived. By 3 o'clock my patience had disappeared completely. As students filed out of the building I made a decision. If Alexander wanted me involved in whatever this was, he could stop speaking in riddles. The address inside the envelope led to a historic building overlooking Central Park. Dark stone. Tall windows. Uniformed staff. The kind of place that quietly announced wealth without ever needing to mention it. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. A receptionist greeted me by name before I introduced myself. Apparently they had been expecting me. That realization did not make me feel better. A private elevator carried me upward. My reflection stared back from the mirrored walls. Nervous eyes. Tense shoulders. A woman who taught 7th grade art and somehow kept ending up in situations that made no sense. The elevator opened onto a quiet floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline. Late afternoon sunlight painted everything gold. And standing beside the glass was Alexander Romano. He turned as I approached. Today he wore a charcoal suit without a tie. Less formal than the gala. Somehow more intimidating. You came. You sent me a photograph instead of an explanation. His expression almost softened. Fair point. I placed the picture on the table between us. Who is she? Alexander looked at the image for several seconds before answering. Her name was Eveline Hart. The name meant nothing to me. Yet something about hearing it made my chest feel unexpectedly heavy. How do you know her? I asked. His gaze drifted toward the skyline beyond the windows. Because 24 years ago, she saved my life. The answer stunned me. Not because of what he said. Because of how he said it. There was no performance in his voice. No calculación. Only memory. Real memory. Painful memory. And the little girl? I asked carefully. His eyes returned to the photograph. The room seemed quieter somehow. Even the city noise beyond the glass felt distant. She disappeared. The words landed heavily between us. Disappeared. Alexander nodded once. One day she was there. The next day every trace of her vanished. My heartbeat quickened. I looked down at the photograph again. At the laughing child. At the ring. At the woman holding her. Then I noticed something I had somehow missed before. A small birthmark near the child's left temple. Tiny. Barely visible. My hand rose instinctively toward my own temple. Toward the mark I had carried my entire life. My fingertips remained pressed against my temple long after I noticed the birthmark. The room seemed to tilt slightly beneath me. I looked down at the photograph again. Then back at Alexander. Then back to the photograph. The tiny mark was in exactly the same place. Small. Faint. Easy to overlook unless you knew it was there. For years I had never thought much about it. Now it felt impossible to ignore. Alexander watched me carefully. Not like a predator. Not like a businessman. Like someone standing at the edge of an answer he had chased for most of his life. Claire. His voice was calm. What is it? I lowered the photograph slowly onto the table. The birthmark. My throat felt dry. The little girl has the same one. For a moment neither of us moved. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued as if nothing had changed. Yellow taxis crawled through traffic. People hurried along sidewalks. The city carried on completely unaware that my world had just shifted beneath my feet. Alexander looked at the photograph again. Then at me. Something unreadable crossed his expression. Hope? Perhaps. Or fear. I noticed it years ago, he admitted quietly. It was one of the details I remembered most. I sank into the chair beside the conference table. My legs suddenly felt weak. This cannot be real. The words escaped before I could stop them. There has to be another explanation. Alexander did not argue. There might be. I appreciated that answer more than certainty. Certainty would have felt dishonest. There were too many missing pieces. Too many unanswered questions. Tell me about her, I said. Evelyn. His eyes drifted toward the photograph once more. She was kind. The answer surprised me. Not because of the word itself but because of how quickly he said it. No hesitación. No need to think. Most people remember accomplishments, I said softly. You remembered kindness. A faint smile touched his face. That was her accomplishment. The silence that followed felt strangely comfortable. For the first time since the gala, neither of us seemed interested in pushing for answers. We were simply sitting with the mystery. Eventually Alexander opened a drawer and removed a thin folder. The paper looked old. Carefully preserved. He slid it across the table. What is this? Everything I could never explain. I opened it slowly. Inside were photographs. Newspaper clippings. Handwritten notes. Dates. Locations. Names. The collection stretched back more than 2 decades. Page after page documenting one woman's disappearance and the search for a missing child. My chest tightened as I turned each page. This was not obsession. It was devotion. Someone had spent years refusing to forget. Then a single document caught my attention. Adoption records. Partial records. Several lines had been blacked out. Yet one date remained visible. I stared at it. My breath caught. The date matched the year I entered the foster care system. Alexander. My voice barely rose above a whisper. He looked up immediately. I pointed to the page. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then his phone rang. The sound shattered the quiet. He glanced at the screen and frowned. The reaction was immediate. Subtle. But unmistakable. Whatever message appeared there was unexpected. He stood and walked a few feet away before answering. I could not hear the entire conversation. Only fragments. Short questions. Short answers. Then complete silence. When he ended the call and turned back toward me, the color had drained from his face again. Exactly as it had the night of the gala. What happened? I asked. Alexander looked directly at me. Someone else has started asking questions about the ring. The words settled heavily between us. Someone else has started asking questions about the ring. A cold sensation moved through my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning humming softly above us. What does that mean? I asked. Alexander remained standing beside the window, the phone still resting in his hand. For the first time since I met him, he seemed uncertain about how much to tell me. It means the ring was not forgotten by everyone. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun slipping lower across the city skyline. Long shadows stretched between buildings. The golden light that had filled the room only minutes ago now seemed dimmer somehow. You keep speaking like the ring belongs to some larger story. My voice sounded sharper than I intended. If I am part of that story, I deserve the truth. Alexander studied me for several seconds. Then he nodded once. You do. He returned to the table and opened the folder again. From the very bottom he removed a single photograph that looked older than all the others. The edges were worn. The colors had faded almost completely. He placed it carefully in front of me. The image showed a small white house near the ocean. Wind bent the tall grass surrounding it. A woman stood on the porch holding the hand of a little girl. Even from a distance I recognized the woman immediately. Evelyn. Where was this taken? I asked. Cape Cod. Alexander's voice softened slightly. Summer of 24 years ago. I stared at the picture. Something about it felt familiar. Not visually familiar.
Emotionally familiar.
Like hearing a song you had forgotten but somehow still remembered. Why are you showing me this? Alexander pointed toward the porch railing. I leaned closer. Hanging from a nail beside the front door was a small wooden sign. Most of the paint had chipped away, but several letters remained visible.
Heart Cottage.
My breath caught. Heart. The same last name as Evelyn. That house still exists, Alexander said quietly. I bought the property years ago. I looked up. Why? Because I never stopped hoping answers would be waiting there. Silence settled between us again. Then his assistant appeared near the doorway. Margaret Hayes. Professional. Composed. Yet even she seemed unusually serious. Alexander. He turned immediately. What is it? The records arrived. She carried a large envelope. Thick. Official. Alexander accepted it without another word. The room suddenly felt smaller. More tense. He opened the envelope carefully and removed several documents. His eyes moved across the pages. Once. Twice. Then a third time. The color slowly drained from his face. My pulse quickened. What did you find? He looked at me. Not at the documents. At me. The adoption records. My stomach tightened. And Alexander exhaled slowly. The original files were altered. Every sound in the room seemed to disappear. Altered. I repeated. Someone changed names, dates, locations. He lowered the papers onto the table. Whoever handled the records wanted the trail to disappear completely. I stared at him, unable to process everything. My childhood. My adoption. The ring. Evelyn. The missing girl. None of it felt separate anymore. It felt connected by threads I could not yet see. Then Alexander slid one final page across the table. A copy of an intake form from a foster agency. Near the bottom sat a handwritten note. Short. Barely one sentence. Yet it made my heart stop. Child arrived wearing silver ring. Ring removed before registration. The sentence seemed impossible to process. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Child arrived wearing silver ring. Ring removed before registration. My eyes remained fixed on the page while my mind struggled to catch up. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the faint hum of traffic beyond the glass windows. The sound felt disconnected from reality, like it belonged to another world. The ring was with her, I whispered. Alexander nodded slowly. According to this document, yes. I looked down at the silver band resting on my finger. For years it had been nothing more than a keepsake. A final gift from my adoptive mother. Something comforting. Familiar. Now it felt heavier. As if it carried 24 years of unanswered questions inside a few ounces of metal. How did I get it back? I asked. Alexander remained silent for a moment. That is the question I have been trying to answer. Margaret stepped closer and placed another document beside the first. There is more. Her voice was careful, controlled. The paper appeared older than the others. Handwritten notes filled most of the page. Several names had faded almost beyond recognition, yet one section remained readable. I leaned forward. Foster placement request. Temporary assignment. Requested by Eleanor Bennett. My breath caught. Eleanor Bennett. My adoptive mother. The woman who had raised me. The woman who taught me how to paint, how to ride a bicycle, how to believe kindness mattered. She requested me? I asked. Margaret nodded. According to the agency records, she specifically asked for placement. Alexander watched my reaction carefully. Did she ever tell you how she found you? I shook my head. She always said it was fate. The words sounded strange now. Too simple. Too incomplete. I opened the folder again and searched through the remaining documents. Photographs. Reports. Correspondence. Fragments of a story that had been scattered across decades. Then one image stopped me completely. A newer photograph. Taken perhaps 6 years earlier. It showed Eleanor sitting on a park bench. Smiling. Holding a cup of coffee. Normal. Ordinary. Yet she was not alone. Standing several feet behind her was a man in a dark coat. Watching. Not interacting. Watching. My stomach tightened. Who is that? Alexander's expression hardened slightly. We do not know. You investigated her? The question escaped before I could stop it. After she passed away. His voice remained calm. I needed answers. I stared at the photograph again. Suddenly dozens of memories resurfaced. Moments I had dismissed at the time. Eleanor occasionally. Checking the locks twice before bed. Looking over her shoulder in crowded places. Growing quiet whenever I asked questions about my earliest years. At the time I assumed she was protective. Now I wondered if she had been afraid. She knew something, I whispered. Alexander nodded. I believe she knew exactly who you were. The room fell silent. The possibilities settled heavily between us. If Eleanor had known, then she had carried the truth for decades. Protected it. Hidden it. Perhaps for a reason. Then Margaret's phone vibrated softly. She glanced at the screen and immediately looked toward Alexander. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally she handed him the device. He read the message once. His expression changed instantly. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. As though a missing piece had finally appeared. Slowly he lowered the phone and looked directly at me. Claire, he said quietly. We found the woman who processed your original foster intake paperwork. She is still alive. Rain covered the city the following morning. Thin silver lines slid down the car windows as Alexander drove north through quiet suburban streets. Neither of us spoke much during the trip. There was too much to think about. Too much waiting on the other side of the drive. The woman who had processed my foster intake paperwork was named Judith Mercer. 82 years old. Retired. Living alone in a small house outside White Plains. According to the records, she had left social services nearly 20 years earlier. Yet somehow her signature remained attached to the most important missing chapter of my life. The neighborhood was peaceful. Tree-lined streets. Well-kept lawns. Wind chimes hanging from porches. Nothing about the place suggested secrets buried for decades. Judith answered the door herself. She was smaller than I expected. White hair. Kind eyes. A cardigan draped over her shoulders. She looked like someone's grandmother. Someone who baked cookies and sent birthday cards. For a moment I wondered if we had come to the wrong place. Then her eyes landed on me. Everything changed. The smile disappeared from her face. The color drained from her cheeks. One hand gripped the edge of the doorframe for support. No, she whispered. The word barely reached us. That is not possible. Alexander and I exchanged a glance. Judith continued staring at me. Not with confusion. Recognition. Mrs. Mercer, Alexander said gently. We would like to ask a few questions. Her eyes never left mine. Come inside. The house smelled faintly of old books and tea. Family photographs covered the walls. Memories preserved in frames. Judith led us into a small living room and sat carefully in an armchair near the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. For several moments nobody spoke. Then she looked directly at me. You have your mother's eyes. The room fell silent. I felt my heartbeat stumble. Not because of what she said, because of how certain she sounded. As though there was no doubt whatsoever. You knew Evelyn Hart? I asked quietly. Judith closed her eyes. Yes. One simple word. 24 years of mystery suddenly felt closer than ever. What happened? My voice shook despite my efforts to stay calm. Judith opened her eyes again. They looked tired, heavy with memory she had carried for far too long. Your mother came to me. She folded her hands together. She was frightened. Not for herself. For you. I listened without moving. Every nerve in my body focused on her next words. She believed someone was looking for her family. Someone she did not trust. Alexander leaned forward slightly. Did she tell you who? Judith shook her head. No names. She only said that if anything happened, the child must disappear completely. A chill moved through me. Rain continued tapping softly against the window. Judith's voice remained steady. Several weeks later I received a call. The child needed placement. Emergency placement. Her gaze found mine again. You. My chest tightened. The room suddenly felt smaller. Warmer. Harder to breathe in. And Eleanor Bennett? I asked. Judith smiled sadly. Eleanor volunteered immediately. She promised she would protect you. Tears stung unexpectedly behind my eyes. Eleanor had known. All those years she had known. Why did nobody tell me? Judith looked toward a small bookshelf across the room. Because your mother left a letter. My pulse quickened instantly. A letter. Slowly Judith stood and crossed the room. She opened a drawer hidden inside an old wooden cabinet. From within she removed a sealed envelope yellowed by time. Written across the front in fading ink were 5 words. For my daughter when found. My hands trembled as I accepted the envelope. The paper felt fragile, as though time alone had been holding it together. For several seconds I could only stare at the handwriting on the front. For my daughter when found. The room was silent except for the steady rhythm of rain against the window. Judith sat quietly. Alexander stood nearby without speaking. Neither of them rushed me. They understood this moment did not belong to them. It belonged to a woman I had never met and a daughter who had spent 24 years searching for answers without knowing she was searching at all. Carefully I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded letter. The ink had faded slightly, but every word remained readable. My dearest Claire. The moment I saw my name, tears blurred the page. Not Claire Bennett. Not the name written on school records or driver's licenses. Just Claire. As if she had always known exactly who I would become. I swallowed hard and continued reading. If you are holding this letter, then life has been kinder to you than I feared it might be. I wanted to be there to watch you grow. To see your first day of school. To hear about your dreams. To tell you how loved you are. If I cannot do those things myself, then I need you to know one truth above all others. None of this was ever your fault. My vision blurred again. I paused long enough to steady my breathing. The letter continued. There may come a day when people tell you stories about the past. Some will be true. Some will not. Remember this instead. You were loved before you were born. You were loved every day after. And if difficult choices were made, they were made to give you a future free from fear. Beside me, I heard Judith quietly wiping away tears. I kept reading. There is a ring that belongs to our family. If it ever finds its way back to you, trust your heart. The ring was never meant to lead you to money or power. It was meant to lead you home. I looked down at the silver band on my finger. Suddenly every strange coincidence felt less random. Every unanswered question felt connected by an invisible thread. The final paragraph was shorter than the rest. If Alexander Romano ever finds you, tell him I kept my promise. And tell him he must stop blaming himself. I stared at the sentence. Slowly I lifted my eyes toward Alexander. He had gone completely still. For the first time since meeting him, the carefully controlled mask disappeared. There was only emotion. Raw and unmistakable. She knew you would find me, I whispered. Alexander looked away briefly toward the rain-covered window. I never stopped looking. The room fell quiet once more. Not an uncomfortable silence. A peaceful one. The kind that arrives after a storm finally passes. 24 years of missing pieces had begun fitting together. Evelyn Hart had been my mother. Eleanor Bennett had protected me exactly as she promised. Judith had guarded the truth until the right moment. And Alexander had carried a promise through nearly a quarter of a century. I folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. Then I looked at the man who had started this entire journey with a single question. You spent 24 years searching for answers. A faint smile touched his face. He shook his head. No, his voice was quiet but certain. I spent 24 years trying to keep a promise.